CEO's absence, so thank you for that. We have everybody else present here this evening. Before we go any further, are there any declarations from councillors in relation to any items on tonight's agenda? Excellent. There's no announcements and no petitions, so we'll go straight on to public question time. So we've got 15 minutes, or up to 15 minutes. So specifically questions relating to items on tonight's agenda, and just to remind everybody that the meeting is live streamed and recorded, so anything that you say, there's no protections for you. So if you have a question, I encourage you to raise your hand, come to the microphone, and as usual state your name and address and the agenda item that you wish to speak to. So is there any questions or statements?
Does that include deputations?
Well, I had you down to do a deputation in a moment, so if there's no questions or statements, then maybe we can invite you up now to do your deputation. Would you like a chair or did you want to stand up?
I'll stand up. I'll keep it brief.
Okay, so Mr. Bell, you're speaking in relation to item 8.3, the tree reservation order, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Excellent.
Okay. Are we live?
Sorry?
Are we live?
Yes, you're live, so that's not going to project your voice, that's just for recording.
Oh, I see. Thank you. So good evening, councillors and staff, and especially new councillors, and welcome to the council. My name's Lee Bell. I live at 47 7th Avenue, Bassendean. I'm making this deputation to seek support for an extension of a tree preservation order for a flooded gum on my property. And the TPO was first issued by council in June this year. The unanimous decision of council to adopt the TPO has been vindicated in recent months, and I congratulate the council for their foresight on that issue. I note that council staff have recommended a continuation of the TPO following an arborist report commissioned by the town of Bassendean. For the information of new councillors, the 120-year-old flooded gum was in great condition in April 2021, but within a couple of weeks showed signs of great distress and lost most of its leaves. At the time, we suspected it had been poisoned and have since compiled evidence to confirm this. Laboratory tests confirmed the tree has been subject to high levels of systemic poisoning by glyphosate. This conclusion was supported by the Bowden Tree Consultancy, who's a highly qualified arborist employed by the town of Bassendean to inspect the tree and assess its rapid defoliation and recovery potential. A PVC pipe was observed inserted into the tree roots on an adjacent property, and it's the likely point of herbicide injection. Despite this vandalism, our tree is still alive, and the good news is it has 2 active branches that have in recent weeks sprouted new growth, which is a very positive sign of recovery. These branches are critical to the survival of the tree as they provide the pumping system to draw water and nutrients into the tree as it recovers. We made councillors aware of this in June, and to their credit, they united unanimously to create the tree preservation order for the tree to discourage further vandalism and see if signs of recovery became apparent, and that has now started. The Bowden Tree Consultancy have also recommended the application of FOSCAP injections to accelerate the recovery of the tree, and we've just this week engaged a specialist to do this work, which should take place in the next week or so. The 2 branches with new growth are key to the survival of the tree, yet our neighbour has sought repeatedly to engage tree loppers to remove these branches, despite our advice that it would ensure the death of the tree. In recent weeks, he demanded we breach that TPO and remove the branches, or he would seek an order from a magistrate to override the town of Bassendean tree preservation order. In principle, we're not opposed to removing any overhanging branches from a tree that present a risk, but at this point there are no such risks, and that's also been confirmed in the Bowden Tree Consultancy report. And as I mentioned to councillors before the TPO was issued, we've spent over $10,000 regularly maintaining the safety of trees on our property over 20 years. If a request had been made to prune the overhanging branches of the tree when it was in good health, we would have acted on that, but there was no request, just a poisoning of the tree. So I would appeal to all councillors to take a stand against tree vandalism, which is eroding the tree canopy of our town, the habitat of rare cockatoos, and eroding our local amenity. By extending this tree preservation order, it will buy time for the tree to recover further and stabilise. However, decision to remove the TPO at this point will further encourage those who seek to vandalise trees via covert poisoning. TPO is currently the only protection the tree has from those eager to see it dead. So I would encourage you all to adopt the recommendations of staff on this particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. You just want to stay by the microphone for a moment in case there's questions. Thank you for being here this evening. Councillors, are there any questions? And I just encourage questions to relate to the current TPO rather than straying into the alleged cause of the tree's deterioration, please.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. In August 2021, the former council resolved to make the CATS local law, which replaced the responsible cat ownership local law and came into effect on the 15th of October. The Joint Standing Committee on Delegated Legislation has since completed its review of the new local law in accordance with the requirements of the Local Government Act and has determined that an amendment is required to remove reference to the clauses relating to cats being in a place that is not public. This related to the proposal from the town to attempt to confine cats to their owners' properties. All other provisions contained within the local law, including the proposed cat prohibited areas, remain unchanged. Council is required to commit to the undertaking to amend the local law by the 29th of December, and this item recommends Council resolves to undertake the required undertaking and to authorise advertising of the amended local law. In respect to the advertising timeframe, a slight change to the report is required to change the advertising closing date to Friday the 4th of March 2022, and this is a result of the gazettal timeframes from the West Australian and to meet the 42 advertising days required.
Thank you. Questions, councillors?
Thank you, Deputy Madam Mayor, and through you to Donna. Has there been any discrepancies, or has Clause 2.2 come into effect at any stage since it has been in local law?
So it came into effect on the 15th of October and was in effect, but the town hasn't undertaken any action in relation to that. And then following the Joint Standing Committee, we effectively can't act on those provisions, and this will, I suppose, fix that up and formalise that arrangement. So at the completion of the advertising period, the town will post the amended local law on our website and have committed to not issue any infringements in the interim.
Thank you.
So I just want to clarify, it's my understanding, and I checked again with the City of Swan's website, so their website states, the City of Swan is unique to other local governments as we have local law that prohibits cats from entering private property without property owner or occupiers' consent. So I'm just seeking to understand how the City of Swan can have that provision in their local law, yet we're not able to have something very similar included in our local law.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, or Deputy Mayor, sorry. The only other local government that we found that had relevant provisions contained within its local law was the Shire of Manjimup, and they've been enabled by the Joint Standing Committee, and the response that we received on that basis was that because they were a regional local government, that there were different provisions that enabled them to have those provisions. And so we didn't find any evidence within City of Swan's local law itself that they had such provisions, but I can certainly investigate that further for you.
Yeah, that would be fabulous if you don't mind. Any further questions, councillors?
No, that was my question.
I asked Councillor Plivka.
Oh, yes. So our cat laws are as restrictive as they can be, having regard to the Cat Act. Is that essentially what's being put, that we're going to have the most restrictive that the Act will allow us to have?
Yes, through you, Deputy Mayor, that is the case. The provisions within the CAT local law allow for local governments to make its own, the provisions within the CAT Act provide for local governments to make their own local laws, and the penalties that are included in our CAT's local law are the most stringent there are. We're also one of the only local governments that have cat prohibited areas, which in this case has been Daring, Success Hill Reserve and Point Reserve. So most local governments that have cat prohibited areas can only do that on A-class reserves.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, so in the report, or when you just spoke, you mentioned advertising, but in the report it refers to advertising and consultation. Can you clarify for me that is there actually a consultation component, or are we purely saying to the community this is now the situation?
It's both. We're required to undertake advertising and consultation in the same manner as we did when advertising the draft local law itself, but in doing so we'll be advising that the requirement for the advertising is a result of the undertaking that we're required to do.
So if our community was to come back to us again and say we would like to have cats restricted in areas that aren't public, is there then the opportunity to go back to the Joint Standing Committee and say thank you very much, but we would like to pursue this anyway?
Council is required to consider the submissions made during advertising, and our advice would be to not go down that path because we know that the Joint Standing Committee would likely disallow those provisions. It is open to Council to actually go through that process again, but as we've seen from advertising and the advice from the Joint Standing Committee now, it's unlikely that we would be able to include those provisions.
And there's no opportunity for appeal of the decision of the Joint Standing Committee?
Unfortunately not.
Councillor Carter?
Did the Joint Standing Committee explain why they wouldn't allow this particular provision in the local act?
Thank you, through you, Deputy Mayor. The only advice that we received from the Joint Standing Committee was that they had concerns on the ability to, one, restrict the ownership rights of cats, and two, the ability for the town to actually enforce the provisions.
Thank you. Is that it for questions? Okay, thank you for that. We'll move on to item 8.2, which is the road closure for portions of Extension Road and West Road in Bassendean. And if I forget in a moment, please remind me of some questions from Mayor Hamilton that I would like to ask. Are you speaking to this one, Ms. Shaw? Or is it Ms. Wilson?
I am, thank you. So this matter relates to an issue that came about through the approval of the expansion of the Bassendean Shopping Centre by the Joint Development Assessment Panel in 2012. 107 car parking bays were approved and constructed within the adjacent road reserve, outside of the lot boundaries and including portions of Extension Road. For all intents and purposes, these appear to form part of the shopping centre site. Given these bays are located within the town's road reserve, the town is technically responsible for the maintenance of the bays, along with portions of retaining walls and the landscaping. Whilst the shopping centre owners have been paying for the upkeep to date, rectifying this anomaly will ensure that no municipal funds will be needed in future for this purpose.
Thank you. Questions, councillors? Councillor Carter, then Councillor Ames.
Oh, no.
Yeah, Councillor
Yeah.
Blicko.
Okay, thank you. I was on council when this was decided, and one of the reasons is because there wasn't enough parking bays. But if we wanted to retain those mature trees, then we could come at this arrangement, and that was accepted. The issue, I suppose, I'm asking, if we hand this land over to Hawaiian, or we sell it to Hawaiian, will they then own the trees and the landscaping? That's my question.
Yep.
Sorry.
Through you, Deputy Mayor. So first of all, the town wouldn't be selling them the land. So the land's actually Crown Road Reserve.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there was support from council tonight to provide for the closure of the road, the landowners themselves would need to have survey diagrams drawn up and the agreement from the Department of Planning to actually amalgamate that land into their site. So closing the road does not equate to the town gaining money, I suppose. If the land was amalgamated into their site, yes, the trees would be on their site and not within the relevant portion of the road reserve.
Thank you.
So can I just clarify on that? So I know you have a question, Councillor Blicko, because the diagram that's provided in the attachment that shows the new proposed boundary, my reading of that is that almost all of the trees are external to the proposed new boundary, so they'd still remain within the town's control, is that correct?
There's only a slither, sorry I don't have the diagram open, there's only a slither of portion of land, but there is portions of landscaping within that would be amalgamated into the shopping centre site. The majority of the trees along West Road though would remain along the West Road portion of road reserve.
Thank you. Councillor Blicko.
Yes, just a question regarding the road reserve. So presumably somebody at some point in time set aside this land and said that they needed to reserve that land for the purpose of constructing roads. What's changed now that we need less of a reserve than what they deemed we required back then, whenever it was that the road reserve was first put in place?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, and this may be one for the Executive Director of Infrastructure, but the standard width of roads has changed over the years. So for example, the width of neighbourhood connectors that are determined by, say, livable neighbourhoods or Australian standards has changed over the years. I think, especially within somewhere like Bassendean, they're just historical road reserves based on the land tenure at the time.
Are we locking ourselves into a position where in future we can't extend the road? Or is the extension of the road not something which would produce a widening of the road not something that would produce a worthwhile result?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, the portion of road that's proposed to be closed as part of this proposal wouldn't be sufficient enough to provide for additional road widening in future for West Road anyway. So, for example, if you were to amalgamate this portion of land into the shopping centre site, that wouldn't mean that you could in future prevent dual carriageway of West Road, because the road reserve itself wouldn't be wide enough for that anyway at this point in time.
And through this process or some other process, can we somehow insist upon the extent of landscaping, so tree plantings and the like, or do we not have any input into that process?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, no, it wouldn't be part of the road closure process itself. If there was a future development application, we could condition a requirement to provide a revised landscaping plan and additional landscaping measures.
Thank you.
Maybe I can ask the questions that Hamilton has sent through. So, first of all, she asked in relation to the comment in the report where it mentions the potential for a licence or lease agreement instead of Hawaiian purchasing the land. Would you be able to speak to that option?
Yep, definitely. So Part 4 of the Land Administration Act deals with reserves, and that provides the local government the ability to lease land. So, for example, parks that we have can be leased and for a fee. But Part 5 of the Land Admin Act deals with road reserves, and whilst you can enter into a lease agreement over a road reserve, the lease is actually with the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage if the local government agrees, and any funds that come from the leasing of that land go to the state government. So there's no benefit for the town to actually enter into a lease in this respect, just because we wouldn't receive any funds for that. And it's likely that the lease terms may not set out the actual maintenance requirements, given it is still the town's road reserve. So our recommendation as per the report would be to actually close the portion of road reserve and allow that to be amalgamated into the shopping centre site, so then we're no longer responsible for the maintenance of that land.
Thank you. Councillor Lewin.
I'm just concerned that if the trees are going to be retained, that they may prune them hard on the car park side and just let them, sort of be leafy into the road, if you like, which of course may weaken some of the trees. And I'm just wondering what would the position be for the town in terms of tree preservation orders, if it is sold by a state entity to Hawaiian, then what's the tree preservation order options for the town?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So the current landowner of the shopping centre, the managers, weren't actually aware of this land anomaly. The town actually brought it to their attention when reviewing its assets and through road reserve. So I don't think there's any concern that the landowners would prune back the trees, given if they would, they could have done so already, and they haven't. But it is open for the council to make tree preservation orders over that land. It would be the same process as the other item that we have on the agenda tonight, which would simply be advising the landowner and undertaking that consultation before being determined by council.
Thank you.
Just trying to. Have you got the question from Mayor Hamilton, the final one? It's a bit lengthy, so maybe. So it's
Yep.
in relation to the town centre master plan and this particular site, and any redevelopment potential on that site.
Yep, I can. Yep.
That's the road closure.
So the landowner of the shopping centre site could redevelop that site now if they wanted to, regardless. For example, the additional land that they would otherwise acquire through an amalgamation process as a result of closing the road reserve doesn't give them any more development potential than what they otherwise already have. In terms of what process that would be, it would be an amendment to the existing development approval through the Joint Development Assessment Panel for any redevelopment, or if the value of the works was less than $2 million, then it could be determined by the town. So anywhere above $2 million, they can opt in to go back to the JDAP, or any substantial amendment to the shopping centre would be a JDAP determination.
Great, thank you. Councillor Carter.
Yes, thank you. Can I ask, have we spent a lot of money on this before? Is it a financial burden to look after their parking bays?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, to date we haven't spent any money in the maintenance of that land. To be honest, I don't think the landowner was aware of this anomaly, but it's certainly open for them in future to require the town to maintain that land, given it is currently our road reserve.
Thanks for clearing that up, Donna, regarding the expense to the town, but through you, Deputy Madam Mayor, what's the opportunity cost for us having this land amalgamated back into Lot 2? What is there an opportunity? What's the loss to the town with future plans that might already be there if we were to amalgamate it into the shopping centre?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, there's no loss to the town. We don't receive any funds if the road was closed and amalgamated into the adjacent land, because any valuation for that land and funds associated with that amalgamation would go to the state government anyway. But the benefit that we do have is that in future we wouldn't be required to pay for the maintenance of any of the retaining walls, landscaping or car parking bays if they required maintenance in the future, and that's currently the position we're in.
Thank you. Okay, any further questions on that one? Right, so we're going to 8.3, which is the tree preservation law that Mr. Bell spoke to earlier during his deputation. Again, Ms. Shaw, yours?
Thank you. So in June, the former council resolved to make a tree preservation order for the flooded gum tree located at 47th 7th Avenue in Bassendean. The town's recommendation in that report was that the TPO not be made based on the poor health of the tree at the time. In resolving to instead make the TPO, council also resolved to have the matter reconsidered at this meeting to determine if the health of the tree had improved. In October, the town engaged an arborist to undertake an assessment of the tree, and the town met with the landowners and the arborist on site. As outlined in the report, whilst the tree is not considered to have outstanding significance given it's a common species, the arborist found that the tree was in a satisfactory structural condition and its health was capable of improving. It is therefore open to council to retain the TPO given the aesthetic value of the tree, and the town has recommended that the TPO be made.
Thank you. Questions?
The tree is located on land owned by people that want to keep the tree. And the tree protection order, what additional protections does that afford the tree over and above what the owners would ordinarily enjoy, given that it's their tree and they're caring for it and wanting it to prosper?
Through Deputy Mayor, the tree overhangs the neighbouring property's land, and under our current local planning scheme and the TPO provisions, it makes it an offence under the Planning and Development Act for anybody who cuts, trims, damages a tree the subject of a TPO. So if in the event a neighbouring property owner, or in fact even the current owners, were to cut a branch or try and damage the tree, that would be an offence under the Act.
Okay, then, yeah, so in terms of what it would, extending the TPO will do is prevent those overhanging branches from being lopped by the adjoining owner. Is that essentially the effect?
Through Deputy Mayor, it doesn't stop it from occurring, but it makes it an offence.
What, if you could elaborate on that as to...
I will quote our
as
CEO.
Physically you're not able to stop
Yes,
the person.
that's right.
It does render the lopping of those branches
An
illegal.
offence under the Act, yes.
Okay.
And maybe just to clarify for the councillors that weren't present when this came into council previously, there were a number of healthy branches originally, and they were the ones that overhung the fence, was my understanding, so the concern was if they were lopped, then the tree would not have been able to recover. Is that an accurate reflection of the situation?
That's correct.
Councillor Carter?
Thank you. So that means that once the tree hopefully regains its health, and if there's any tree lopping required, then that can be applied for if necessary.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, yes. An application can be made to trim and prune the tree. It just requires the prior approval of the local government.
Okay, but the overarching importance is the preservation of the tree, and lopping at this particular time would be detrimental to its health.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, if the town received a request to trim or cut the tree, we would review the recommendations of the arborist report, or depending on the time of when the request was made, we would seek further independent advice to ensure that any lopping or trimming of the tree would not impact the structural health of the tree.
Thank you.
Councillor Luca?
So that report would go to whether or not a particular branch was dead, I suppose? Is that what that would look at? That it would be dead branches that would be lopped and that everything else that was alive would be salvaged? Is that how it would be approached?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, that is typically the case, but arborists will look at the overall structural makeup of the tree and its overall health. So, for example, they'll try and examine the qualities of the tree itself. So, for example, the bark, any issues to do with the roots or any of the limbs itself. So they undertake a full assessment of the health and structural integrity of the tree, not just specific limbs.
Thank you.
Councillor Ames?
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Madam Mayor, and through you. Is there, I couldn't find within the arborist report, is there a determination of length of time where the tree would be coming back to a healthy standard for appropriate lopping to be done to obviously make all parties within the area happy with the tree itself?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, the arborist was advised to provide advice based on the criteria set out in our local planning scheme on whether or not a TPO was appropriate. So that's to do with whether the tree was significant, the amenity value of the tree and such.
Mm-hmm.
And they were also asked to undertake an assessment of the structural integrity and the health of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't asked to provide comment on how long they thought it might take.
Okay.
And obviously these things can change depending on the health of the tree. But the arborist report did provide recommendations on things that could be done to assist the recovery of the tree, and I suppose it would just relate to ongoing monitoring. In terms of the TPO itself, there's no time restriction within our local planning scheme for the length of a TPO, so once it's imposed, it can be in perpetuity, effectively.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
So the TPO would continue indefinitely and it would be incumbent on the adjoining neighbour to apply to have a branch removed if they can demonstrate that it's unsafe. Is that effectively how the process would work?
Through Deputy Mayor, they would need to make an application to us, but it's not up to the adjacent landowner to demonstrate that it's not unsafe, because it's up to the town to undertake that assessment and make an assessment on whether they think it's appropriate to trim the branches.
So they would start the process and then it would be incumbent on the town to investigate at the town's expense?
That's right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next item was 8.4, which was the application for a holiday house. He's not listed. That's been withdrawn from the agenda. Did you want to speak to why that's withdrawn quickly?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. We've had a recent request from the applicant for the application for the use not listed holiday house. The applicant requested the matter be withdrawn from the agenda to provide her the opportunity to furnish staff with additional information that she believes would assist in gaining staff and council support for the application for development approval. Obviously, with a meeting in December, we don't meet again as a council until February. That would clearly put us outside our statutory timeframe for determining applications. The applicant has agreed to the town's request, or the town's requirement to have a agreement for an extension of time to the end of February, so we're not at risk of defaulting on our statutory timeframes. And the applicant has also agreed to remove the Airbnb ad from the website. So that all being the case, the matter will be before council at the February OCM.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question to that?
Yes, you can.
They've been required to remove the ad. Are they still able to take bookings for that entire period? And they've already been booked?
Through Madam Deputy Mayor, we have advised them that until they have an approval, it would be a breach of the scheme, it would be an offence to allow anyone to use the dwelling as a holiday house. We have been reasonably pragmatic, we think, in this case, by requiring them to take the ad down and accept no further bookings. But given that some people may have made arrangements to occupy the dwelling in the next couple of days, we thought it might have been reasonable to allow them to run their course. Obviously, we'll monitor the situation to make sure there's no, as much as possible, no adverse impacts, but certainly made it clear to the landowner that they're not to take any further bookings.
Just on that, are we going to further develop a policy in relation to this sort of thing?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, yes, that would be the longer term intention. The state government has recently released some documentation about tourism development, so we'll review that, and if necessary we can supplement that with our own local planning policy settings. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to item 8.5, which is local planning policy number 15, percent for art, and council policy number 3, public art policy. Yourself. Thank you, Mr. Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. The purpose of this report is for Council to consider its policy settings in relation to public art. We do currently have two policies relating to public art, one a local planning policy and one a council policy, but they were last reviewed in 2009 and 2014 respectively. The report recommends that Council pursue an amended policy as attached to this report. Importantly, as the amended policy is a draft local planning policy as opposed to a council policy, Council at this stage is only being asked to endorse the policy for the purposes of advertising, and like all of our other local planning policies that have been before Council in the last 2 years, Council will get a second opportunity to review it once we've concluded the advertising process.
Thank you. Questions? Yes,
Sorry.
Carter.
I understand that for it to be accepted for this, the artist has to be qualified to a quite specific extent. That then would rule out quite a lot of community artists. Is that still the intent of this particular policy?
So you're referring to the definition of what an artist is? In the
Yes,
draft
I'm
policy?
sorry, it's just, there was a lot of reading. I can't quite point to it, but
Through Madam Deputy
my
Mayor,
apologies.
if you've got the attachment,
Yeah.
the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2 sets out what an artist is, and there's 4 different dot points, and they are all ors as opposed to ands, so as long as the individual meets one of those 4 criteria, they would be considered an artist for the purpose of this draft policy. If Council wanted to lower the threshold of what constitutes an artist for the purpose of this policy, that would be an option. But we think for the purpose of advertising at this stage, we're comfortable with the definition we've provided in the draft policy. And probably a point I'd make more generally is that in preparing this draft amended policy, we have done a fairly comprehensive review on other local governments with established and successful local planning policies. So this draws off the successes of those other policies.
So just following up with Councillor Carter's question, we had a similar discussion with the last council in relation to art the town might procure, and not wanting to limit emerging artists or people that haven't had the ability to, I guess, exhibit their work yet. Can you remind me what we landed on as a result of that conversation?
Okay. Effectively, if we were to take, I suppose it is, there's 2 different ways the council could really procure public art. One would be to fund it through municipal funds, through the annual budget process. The other would be spending money collected via the development application process. If council was to procure art using the former, using its own money, there's little constraint around that. Obviously, council would need to satisfy itself that it's met the procurement policies, but otherwise, beyond the procurement policies, there would be no other constraints. If council was to be spending money collected via contributions sourced in response to conditions of development approval, it really should be in line with its local planning policy setting, because that art the council is procuring in lieu of the developer providing it at the time. So if council would like to spend, or council indeed will be required to spend money contributed to by developers, but wants to lower the threshold, it would be best done under the local planning policy, either now or following advertising. But long story short, council in spending other people's money in terms of the developers' money should be adhering to the policy that would be imposing on those very same developers.
Can I just clarify, so in the policy, the draft policy, it refers to, this is on page 2, so in the definition of public art, it says, is
referring to interchangeable terms, but
Okay.
I do understand that may create some confusion, so it may well just be needed to remove the term designer, which we can do during the week.
Other questions, Councillor Clifford?
Just following on from that theme, that when we take them as development contributions, that it's effectively somebody else's money and we're constrained as to how we can spend that. Would there be, and once we satisfy those criteria, then there might be a large pool of artists, designers, whomever qualifies, that would have a product that we can purchase. Would there be any utility in forming an arts committee with some external members just to provide that, I suppose, level of objectivity which might be warranted for dealing with other people's money? So there might be some community members that are expert in this field that could assist council members through an arts committee, and there could be quite extensive discussions as to what sort of installations would be put into the town.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, possibly. Other places do have those arts committees, but I would say those other places are dealing with greater volumes of money and obviously, as a consequence, greater number of installations. As you can see from page 28 of the report, the town's holding about $180,000, and some of those, and that is effectively 10 years worth of collections. So we haven't collected a significant volume of money. But I will say that, as has been communicated to councillors previously, the matter of procuring and installing public art is going to be discussed at a councillor workshop in the first half of 2022. So that matter could be discussed at that same time.
One would expect, given the great work done on the town centre master plan, that we're going to see a lot more development in the next 10 years than we have in the past 10 years, and that might be something which would be appropriate.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, yes, certainly optimistic about the, I suppose, the development phase of the next 10 years, and that is why we're preparing this council now, because it may well be that we are on the cusp of more significant developments that meet the threshold to make contributions, but it may well be as well that those developments simply provide public art in the form of art, and the town actually does not receive any contributions going forward, but we do receive a lot more art by virtue of the developments themselves.
Yes.
I'm just interested in the reference to the removal of industrial developments from the policy. So you made the comment that there wasn't a link about how the development created a need for public art. I'm just wondering, first of all, is there a way that we can create that link? And secondly, what is there to stop developers of commercial and residential developments from putting the same argument forward?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, can we, in terms of the first question, I'd suggest there is no way to create a link. The matter has been thoroughly tested at the SAT, and SAT has considered the facts and made a determination.
Sorry, can we have a summary? What was the issue with the industrial properties?
Broadly, that there was no needed nexus. So in terms of imposing conditions of development approval, there needs to be certain tests satisfied before it is deemed an acceptable and appropriate condition. One of the central tenets of that is that there needs to be a need nexus. That is, the development brings about the need for the thing referred to in the condition. Now, if someone is building a house, they would need to have an appropriate stormwater outcome. So the actual approval for the house would generate the need for a condition to lead to the stormwater outcome. What SAT determined in relation to industrial development and public art is that there was no nexus between the two, and the provision of the industrial development did not give rise to a need for public art. Now, in terms of the second element of the question, what would stop a residential or commercial proponent trying to run the same argument, the answer to that's pretty straightforward, is that has been tried and it has effectively failed, and SAT has effectively reinforced that a public art condition or a requirement for a contribution in either art or cash is an appropriate condition. So that's been tested a couple of times. So So there does seem to be a meaningful distinction between commercial, residential, mixed-use development in relation to public art and industrial development in relation to public art. So there is obviously the SAT matter we've quoted on page 27 of the report, but equally there's a series of SAT references where the requirement has been reinforced for residential and commercial. So whilst there is nothing stopping a proponent trying it on, there would be a series of SAT references that they would have to effectively battle against.
Just on that, so SAT formed a view that people frequenting industrial areas don't appreciate art, or I mean, what is the underlying basis? I mean, I don't quite understand. I mean, if I were driving through an industrial area, I'd quite like to see maybe a fountain or something more uplifting than a tilt-up concrete building.
Through Deputy Mayor, I don't suspect SAT was passing judgment on whether employees in an industrial estate appreciate or don't appreciate art. What it was saying was that it is not an obligation of the developer to provide that art. So there is nothing stopping a local government through its annual budgetary process from allocating funds to public art and for those funds to be directed to an industrial area. That's certainly open to the council, but it effectively determined there was a disconnect between the industrial development and the public art from a need nexus perspective.
Thank you.
Just one, sorry, Councillor Ames.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Madam Mayor, and through you to Mr. Gibson. Obviously, we're talking more so permanent art structures within this policy. Correct in saying that?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, typically, I suppose if you there's examples all over the metropolitan area. There, we probably have an example which the town didn't provide, but there's a bench at the west end of Old Perth Road. The green structure in Forest Place would be a typical example of public art. So yeah, typically it's hard infrastructure. It's often decorative. It's a landmark. It divides opinion. But yeah, typically they're permanent installations.
And the reason for my question is there any opportunity that within the town, maybe moving forward with this policy, that the town might be able to offer a particular area for a rotational public art opportunity for a number of artists? So instead of having a small number of public art opportunities for a small number of artists, there might be greater opportunity for either lower income or lower, I suppose, or greatness of art. That might be more of a rotational opportunity to have more visual opportunities within the town.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, we probably need to explore exactly what that looked like. Broadly, there'd be no issue, I don't think. If it's about the town offering up one or more of its facilities to display art, that could be facilitated. If it's about providing funding for budding artists, that can be done under the community funding policy. If it's about rewarding local artists for their achievements, that can already be done under the community awards policy. So we do have a series of frameworks that probably already address the issue, but it's probably more about understanding what that proposal would look like and what would be the best way to facilitate.
Sure.
That would be directly related to this particular policy.
No, sure.
Just following on from that, so the money would have to be applied towards the art itself. We couldn't, for example, accumulate money and purchase a gallery which could be used for this rotation of art. The money is reserved for the actual art. Is that the case?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, that's correct. I suppose that the cash is being provided to the town in lieu of the art being provided on site. So it would probably be an inappropriate use of those funds to simply stockpile it all to actually just provide a facility. It's not to say it couldn't be done. It would be a bit atypical, but it certainly could be explored as to whether that would be an appropriate use of the funds. Whether that's something the town wants to get into is probably a whole other question. And I would go back to, I suppose, page 28, where we're only holding $180,000 of funds currently, noting, of course, that may increase over time, but just as possible is we don't actually get any increase via the upcoming development phase, because developers may well choose to provide the art on their site.
Just while you're on that page, at the top under design and implementation, it refers to the responsibility of the landowner to maintain the public art in perpetuity. If they provide
purpose of this report is to provide council with the evaluation of the use of a town facility by 5,000 meals, as was requested by the then council in September 2020, when it granted free use of office space next door at the Volunteer Centre. The evaluation demonstrated genuine community benefit was derived from the use of the office space, and in discussing the matter with the group, there is a desire that they remain there for another 12 months at least. Whilst the issue of the use was previously decided by council, a further extension of use from this point can actually be managed by staff in accordance with council's recently adopted community leasing framework. Therefore, this report is essentially for council's noting.
Any questions, councillors? Can I just ask out of interest, this group has provided catering for a number of our events recently, which has been fantastic. I'm just wondering what the benefit is to them. I'm assuming that the town is reimbursing them for their costs and they're getting a financial benefit for this service.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, yes, I believe the town is providing a nominal fee to them. That information probably can be provided in more detail next week, but it's certainly, as I understand it, not full commercial rates.
Thank you.
I'll quickly ask a question. Thank you, Deputy Madam Mayor, and obviously through you to Mr. Gibson. It's been great that we've had this opportunity for 5,000 meals using the space. Has there been any detriment over the last 12 months, as in extra costs that have been borne by the town in regards to maintenance or repairs or security issues or anything of that nature?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, not that I'm aware. They're only using a small office space. They do their cooking off-site, so they're using the office space broadly for administrative purposes. So certainly not that I'm aware of, unless Mr. Adams is aware of any issue. I would suggest, given that the use is sorry, Mr. Adams. Given the use is relatively innocuous, it's administrative with the cooking done off-site, I'd suggest there's no issue.
Great.
Okay, so we'll move on to item 8.7, which is the ICT strategy for 2020 to 2025 annual review. Mr. Wong.
Thank you, through you, Deputy Mayor. Council received the town's ICT strategy in December last year. The ICT strategy is supported by what we call an ICT strategic plan, which essentially breaks down the elements of the strategy into sort of achievable projects and distributes them over the 5 years of the strategy itself. So the purpose of this report to council is to provide a report on the progress that we've made in implementing the strategy over the first 12 months. And it's recommended that council receives the progress report and notes that future annual reviews of the strategy will be provided to councillors via the bulletin rather than coming to council.
Beautiful, thank you very much. Questions, councillors? Councillor Plivka?
Is this all budgeted?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, there hasn't been a full incorporation of the full 5 years of the strategy into the long-term financial plan at this stage. So what's happening is at the moment we're coming to council on an annualised basis for a budget for the following year of requirement for the strategy. Although at the outset council did set aside funds into a reserve in recognition that significant funds will be required probably in years sort of 3 and 4 of the strategy when we can't start to look at our central enterprise system. So there has been, I think, significant funding set aside by council, but the whole 5 years of the strategy isn't fully incorporated into the long-term financial plan at this point.
And that follows on with this upgrade needs to occur on account of some of the recommendations that we got from our auditors, so we don't really have a choice. Is that the case? We have to get these things done?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I think we always have a choice. I think as time goes on, a lot of the council's ICT infrastructure is quite aged. I think some of the elements in the strategy, particularly the ones that we have undertaken so far in year 1, we felt that there was little choice given the risks to business continuity and also to perhaps cybersecurity risks that are fairly prevalent So we felt that some serious attention needed to be given to those aspects, and that's occurred. As far as moving forward with perhaps some of the central elements of the strategy, particularly the enterprise system, there are choices available there, but I think at some point in time in the future, there will come a time, inevitably at some point I think, where our current system will not be supported by the vendor. I mean, there's certainly no indication that that's occurring now, but certainly it's a shelf life. So I think it's prudent for us to start looking at alternatives now, given that there is a significant preparation lead time for the town to try and get its data in a position for it to be migrated to a new system, and also to try and sequester some funds away through budgets and try and plan for that to occur. It's a fairly long-term process to upgrade an enterprise system.
There are these costs on the horizon that we need to start budgeting for, because they're, from what I'm hearing, they're unavoidable. Place isn't going to operate in the best way if we don't have those systems.
Yes, through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I think that it's fair to say that that the town will become less efficient if we don't take some measures. But the corollary of that is that if we can actually implement the bulk of this strategy, I think we can realise some really significant efficiency gains, and to be able to focus our activities a lot more onto community-facing initiatives, and also better supporting council, and at a practical level, having staff spending the bulk of their time on value-adding work rather than system downtime and more sort of administrative type processes. So I think there really are some potential efficiency gains here. So it's not all about cost out. There are certainly some significant benefits that come back into the town as well.
Okay. Thank you. Certainly a very important issue.
So just following on from Councillor Porter's comment, you mentioned start budgeting for, but I know in the report that the last 2 years there's been quite significant investments from your annual budget. You mentioned year 3 and 4 potentially being quite significant. Are you anticipating substantially more financial allocation than what's been provided in the last 2 years?
I think potentially yes, when it comes to looking at the enterprise system, that could be the case. However, there's a lot of preparation work that needs to occur before then. We haven't looked at the market, looked at different products that are becoming available, and I think there is a growth in products coming onto the market that may be suitable for a local government like the town of Bassendean. In the past, there's sort of been a couple of extremes, I suppose. Some high-level products that are geared towards the larger local governments, and then products that are geared towards the smaller local governments. But there seems to be a blending of that at the moment. So I think when it comes time for us to go to market, I think we're faced with some really some good options for us.
Councillor Carter, and then did you hand over to Councillor Anderson?
No.
Councillor Carter.
Could I just ask the platform you seem to have chosen or looking at, is that also in other local government authorities? Have you
Yes,
are they
Madam
across the
Deputy
board?
Mayor. Yes, it is. So it is a fairly new product. There was a pilot project done by 3 local governments who partnered with the vendor to develop the product, and they have been partnering with individual local governments to roll out certain modules of the particular product. However, having said that, I will say, I suppose, that in the 12 months since the strategy was adopted by council, the factor that I mentioned a short time ago in relation to additional competition within the market means I think that we're not locked into that particular approach, even though it is in the strategy at the moment. There's still quite a bit of water under the bridge to come before we would actually go to market, and we wouldn't be sort of locking ourselves into a particular vendor at this point. I
Okay.
think that was more, certainly it is stated in the ICT strategy more in line with our budget position than rather a whole shift from an old product to a new one. So that was attractive as well. But I think it's incumbent upon us to actually, at the time, go to market and come up with the best possible solution for the town to recommend to council.
Can I just follow on with that? The systems that you're going to choose, is there any thought that you might need to align it to either partial or wholly amalgamation in the future, and how that would align with our neighbours?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, that is a consideration that we will look at. Having said that, I think some of the products by our larger neighbours might be a little bit out of our reach at this point in time. However, there's certainly nothing to prevent us having discussions and hopefully sort of future-proofing ourselves in that regard. But it's, I guess at the moment, there's no, it's not on the horizon, so we'll be pushing ahead with what's best for the town, but we would take into account all those environmental factors in that decision, in that recommendation, sorry.
Okay, anything further? Thank you. So item 8.8 is the execution of documents, policy and authority to sign documents on behalf of the town. You again, Mr. White?
No,
Sorry, Ms. Kanya?
thank you very much, Madam Deputy Mayor. I would like to draw attention, Council's attention to the fact that there is an incorrect reference in the background section to a delegation that says the CEO had the ability to sign documents on behalf of the town. The delegation that dates back from 2015 actually refers to the affixing of the common seal to documents requiring signing and sealing of reports. And that was to the Mayor and to the CEO, and then it was being confirmed at each ordinary council meeting. So that will be rectified for the OCM. It will also affect the comment section of the first sentence there under execution of documents, which will be deleted, and that will then actually put the document basically state the correct situation. What this policy is planning to do is to make sure that we actually have the authorisations in place and a structured approach to how we sign our documents, so that the Mayor, Council, CEO are aware of what documents can be signed or are authorised to be signed, and then there will be no confusion, and there will also be efficiency. At the moment now, we do have a few situations where documents come to the CEO's office, and the CEO's office is like, do we have the authorisation to do this? Do we then have to bring it back to council? And then that requires a council report and delays in the actual signing of these documents, which shouldn't be necessary. So that is with regards to the policy as to the reason why it's being brought up. Are there any questions as to the policy?
I had a question. So in the actual policy document itself, doesn't have a page number, but category 2 documents does not require the common seal. In the second section of the table, it refers to memorandums of understanding. Am I reading this correctly, that documents like that would not need to come to council for a council decision, that the CEO would do up an MOU independent of council having oversight of that?
The way that is stated, it would suggest that there would be that the CEO would be able to sign an MOU on behalf of the local government. I would suggest that it wouldn't be a situation where the CEO is creating an MOU
expression of interest process. We're in the process of assess all the applications. We've got a good handle on each of the groups. We're currently just assessing a couple of environmental groups to see whether they're doing work on behalf of the town, whether they're not already otherwise covered by our existing insurance, and therefore whether they actually need the community insurance. So we're just compiling more information on that. Once we have that answer, we'll be able to determine, therefore, how many policies we effectively need, and it will either be within the bounds of council's budget allocation, and everyone could potentially have a complete subsidy. But if the number of eligible applications exceeds the number of policies we can procure via the budget, there will need to be some decisions made about how we, I suppose, share the subsidies around. So the head of power, I suppose, in the community funding policy, which says that the CEO or the town is able to provide community insurance. As Ms. Kennedy suggests, that council policy regarding community funding and this council policy regarding authorisations and delegations will enable the town to effectively sign up to a community insurance policy. So further information on that in terms of the actual community groups will be provided to the board.
Right, and are you anticipating that will be resolved sort of early in the year?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, if it's not late this year, it'll be very early next year.
Fabulous, thank you. Anything further, councillors? So item 8.9 then is the review of attendance and events policy. This is you, Tanya, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry.
It's really a mouthful.
Yes. So this one is it's a review of our attendance and events policy. It was brought up to council in December 2020, but it had at the base of it an annual review, and with policies such as these that affect council, and especially after a council election, it's always considered to be good practice to bring these policies back up to council for review. There is actually only one amendment to make to this policy, and it is an incorrect reference to another policy. It refers to the council allowances policy. That's actually incorrect. It's the council allowances and expenses policy, and for effectively to ensure that the two policies marry up, it's been deemed appropriate to actually amend it.
Thank you for that. Can I just ask you about your comment about reviewing this one annually rather than biennially? I'm just wondering why you're recommending that. I can understand after each council election. Is there a good reason for that to occur? Just seems like a lot of resources going into council reports.
It probably might be deemed to be that, but it is an attendance and events policy, so it could be subject to change during the course of the year. It is quite open to council though to review it every second year if that's the intent.
Thank you.
And that can be reflected.
Any other questions, councillors? Thank you for that. We'll go on to item 8.10 then, which is the review of councillor training and professional development policy.
Thank you. This one actually does have to come up to council after every council election. Also, it was deemed good practice to bring it up as well as an annual review, simply for the basis of the fact that courses can change and it actually reflects course names. So it needs to ensure that it is constantly reviewed and amended if necessary. And this is just for council to note the review as required under the Act.
Thank you. Councillors, any questions? Thank you for that. So we'll go on to item 10.11, which is leader representation policy for elected members and employees.
It's 8 and 11, I think.
Oh, sorry. That is correct.
Thank you once more. Since it's policy overload from council point. This one
something equivalent to directors and officers insurance for these things? So rather than saying the council is going to offer assistance with legal fees to insure against some of these risks?
I will have to defer to Mr. Wright with regards to our insurance.
Thank you through, Madam Deputy Mayor. Yeah, the council does maintain insurance through LGIS. And there is a management liability component. I should say the correct term is coverage for the LGIS scheme cover, but it's there is management liability insurance, so that would apply in the case of perhaps any negligence or allegation of negligence by the management team. But I think the intent of this policy is that it's somewhat broader in that it may allow defence against other non-management liability matters, perhaps defamation and other things, and it may also even allow for the bringing of proceedings in certain circumstances as well. But yes, we do certainly maintain considerable insurance coverage for management liability.
When you say management team, is that the executive and the council? Or
I need to check the policy. I can maybe take that notice and go back to council.
that'd be fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, just following on, 'cause, you mentioned defamation. I mean, that would be commenced in the Supreme Court. Your 10,000, even if someone were charging at the scale, it's not going to last more than 20 hours, which isn't going to be enough for a Supreme Court trial to prove the truth of something that might be patently true that somebody states in council, but somebody else doesn't like that they've said that. So there are, I think, those sorts of risks, and probably becoming more so. Were we able to make inquiries as to sort of what insurance products are available, so that I suppose everybody can be insured as much as possible, so people not to abuse it, but to have the ability to function without having to constantly look over their shoulder and wonder whether somebody's going to take issue with something that they say, even if it is correct.
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, yes, we can certainly go back to council with some more information on insurance.
That'd be fabulous, thank you. That was one of my questions as well, but I just had a question about a couple of the clauses in the policy. So there's clause 3.10 and clause 6.1. And 3.10 refers to $3,000 approved by the CEO before a council decision, and 6.1 refers to up to $10,000 when a delay would impact the legal rights of the applicant. I'm just not sure how those two clauses work together.
So in terms of generally, are we at
3.10 and 6.1. It's okay if you answer that later.
Yeah, I might say that.
Mr. White's not going to answer that.
Thank you through you, Madam Deputy Mayor. My understanding is that the $3,000 would be sort of almost like an emergency fund, so that if immediate action was required, there could be authorisation to the CEO to provide a very small capability for that to occur. The subsequent report to council seeking additional allocation of funds. I guess I'd also add that if this policy is adopted by council, I think it would be prudent to include a small budget allocation each year to facilitate the implementation of the policy without having to sort of come to council for a budget every time something might occur.
Thank you, that's how I interpret it, but then 6.1, when it says delegation to the CEO, it says, in cases where a delay in the approval of an application may be detrimental to legal rights of the applicant, the CEO may exercise on behalf of the council any of the powers of the council under clause 5.1 5.2 to a maximum of $10,000. I just wasn't sure how the $3,000 emergency and the $10,000 when there's a delay, yeah. Okay, June the week is fine. And sorry, Ms. Carter, can you explain to me under 5.2 it refers to a security agreement? I'm not sure what that is.
so that would probably be in the case where you would request that in the event somebody might need to repay the legal costs, you've got
item 8.12 then is the adoption of the Town of Bassendean Annual Report for 2020-2021. Oh, Ms. Carter.
Who wants to take that one? So, yes, through you, Deputy Madam Mayor, yes, we have the adoption of the Town of Bassendean Annual Report for 2020-21. This year we actually do have the two documents going together, and I would just like to alert councillors to the fact that we will table the report, and that will be coming straight to council. Again, it's been conducted in-house, the actual report, and it is a text-based only, it's not the one that actually has the graphics, etc.
Thank you for that. Any questions, councillors? Councillor Carter?
I'm curious as to why there's nothing in there about the disposal of the pensioner guard cottage, as that was quite a major event in the town.
This is to the year to 30th June.
So it's the last financial year and the disposal of the.
Yes, I
it was
do
in this
understand.
financial year.
Sorry, but May 2020 is when the decision is made, and other decisions are made during 2020, 2021.
Through Madam Deputy Mayor, I think the decision that was made to actually dispose of the property to the Museum of Perth may have been made in this current financial year. Certainly there were decisions made in the previous financial year that ultimately led to that last decision, but I suppose they were preliminary decisions with the final decision made this current financial year.
Okay, thank you.
So this following on from that, I imagine that will feature in terms of the annual report for this current year.
That is correct.
Other questions? Councillor Hooper?
Just relating to the general meeting of electors, I think some time ago we were talking about when we would put policies out for advertising and sort of when people were on holiday or not. Is that date, is that a statutory date or is that one that we've selected? And if so, could we maybe move it to a time where we can ensure that people are back and engaged with issues before they attend that meeting?
So Deputy Mayor, it is actually a statutory date.
Oh, okay.
Is it 42 days after adoption or something like that?
56.
56.
And in terms of the adoption then, can that can be done sooner or later or?
We then have statutory requirements for adoption of our financial reports, which is the trigger for all of this to occur.
Yes, so through you, Madam Mayor, the financial report needs to be adopted by council by the end of the calendar year, and then there's 56 days, I think, from that point to hold the general meeting of electors.
How soon can it be done though?
It'll be done, the soonest we can adopt the financial report would be next Tuesday night.
No, I understand currently that is, but theoretically how early in the year could you
It's
adopt that?
dependent upon audit, so I would suggest that every year, certainly the three annual reports that I've been involved in at the town, it's a struggle to get into council by the end of the calendar year, and that's primarily as a result of waiting for the auditors to complete their work and the opinion to be issued by the Auditor General.
Just for the benefit of councillors who aren't on the audit and governance committee, there was the auditors attended that meeting, there was a discussion that Councillor Politicar initiated around potentially setting the date for the annual meeting of electors ourselves in advance of the auditors in future and giving them that date to work towards. So that's probably a conversation we can have in future. Other questions? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item 8.13, which is the land asset strategy. And just reminding councillors, when you're asking your questions, that the attachment is confidential. Mr. Gibbs, would you like to speak to the item?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. The purpose of this report clearly is for council to consider adopting the draft amended land asset strategy. A draft land asset strategy was presented to the last council in June 2020, and at that time council receive the strategy as opposed to adopt it. Obviously, in the intervening period, various things have occurred. Probably the most significant as it relates to the town's land assets is, of course, the adoption of the Town Centre Master Plan, given such a high proportion of the town's assets exist in and around the town centre. So given that master plan is now adopted, it is opportune to actually review the strategy, and it is also a matter that has been tasked to start by the corporate business plan. So if councillors have any questions, happy to take them, but that will need to be behind closed doors.
That leads to the question, are we going to discuss this tonight or?
So, the next item is actually moving on to confidential business, so if there are questions, maybe we can move on to confidential business. No, I'm pleased to know. Before we do though, I